Can you guess which spec dies the most in solo shuffle? It's actually Affliction Warlock, but why? Well, for one, the spec is one of the biggest threats when left unchecked. As it turns out, Affliction ranks 3rd highest in overall DPS, and actually ranks number 2 when it comes to damage during burst windows. Affliction Warlocks also lost a lot of self-healing in the War Within, which makes them great targets for any melee. So the moment you zone into the arena and see this icon, you already know who to attack. But what if there isn't a Warlock on the enemy team? Who's the best target now? The truth is that games are sometimes won or lost based on the decisions your team makes in the starting room, and whether you are quick to swap on defensives and continue pressure in the mid game. But with every class having thousands of buffs cluttering their frames, it can be hard to actually see when it's the right time to swap. I mean, just look at this mess. Good luck finding the information you actually need. Luckily, the skill capped add-on reduces tons of clutter and allows you to see the game just like a rank 1 gladiator, all with the click of a single button. Anyone can download and install our complete UI package right now, and skill cap members even get premium profiles that actually help you win games by isolating key information like enemy defensives, which is exactly what we're covering in today's guide. And with our new class courses for the War Within, you can truly make your damage count. Just imagine how much more effective your damage can be once you know how to carry your momentum like a pro. From learning your damage rotation to mastering the best burst combos, we cover everything you need to climb in solo shuffle. As always, we back everything up with a rank up guarantee. If you don't gain at least 400 rating while using our service, you don't pay. So visit the discount links below to get started with the best UI and the best guides for WoW PvP. To make shot calling easier, we will give each DPS spec one of 3 rankings. The first is good to train, which is pretty self-explanatory, but these are the specs that either take a lot of damage or are important to shut down, like those damned Affliction Warlocks, since they can put out a lot of pressure if left unchecked. Then on the opposite end, we have Skill Check, which are specs that can be tanky, especially when played well. Most of the time, you really want to avoid training these specs unless you have the perfect comp to do so. In the middle, we have the Neutral category, which can be good to hit if there's no other options. We're going to be treating healers differently, but more on that later. First up, we have both Unholy and Frost Death Knight. Now, right away, we're going to place both in the Neutral category. Let's explain why. Choosing a DK as the primary target in solo shuffle can be a huge mistake if both you and your partner are caster DPS. By now, you probably know that Death Knights have some of the best anti-caster cooldowns in the game, with AMS being especially difficult to deal with for any dot class since the shield can be tough to break. DKs even have some passive magic damage mitigation talents and even take less damage at lower HP, and we should mention for clarity that both of these passives are nerfed in PvP, but are still really good, sometimes giving them enough of a buffer to recover with Death Strike. With that said, both Frost and Unholy can take a remarkable amount of damage from pure physical specs like Feral Druids, Fury Warriors, and can get bullied by Hunters. And since some of their defensives are nerfed by dampening, DKs can make really good targets in the late game, especially if you have a disarm effect in order to negate Death Strike. So the TLDR is if you have a melee heavy lobby, then DKs can be excellent targets, but with multiple casters in your lobby, you might want to focus someone else. Demon Hunter is where things can get a bit confusing. Despite having a slow start to the season, Demon Hunters still have one of the lowest death rates in solo shuffle. Just like Death Knights, DH is a spec with just the right amount of passive damage reduction that makes them a bit obnoxious to deal with as a caster. For melee, Demon Hunters can be a bit hard to kill too, since Blur is one of the most efficient anti-melee cooldowns in the game. The best way to reliably kill Demon Hunters is to 100 to 0 in a stun, since Netherwalk is basically a get-out-of-jail-free card against anything that isn't a sub-rogue. So with a fair mix of passive damage reduction and strong efficient CDs, Demon Hunters will be going in the Neutral category. With another class down, let's move on to Druids, starting with Boomies. As a reminder, we will skip Resto for now, since we will be covering all healers later in this video. If you watched our targeting guides in Dragonflight, you might remember that Boomkin was one of the best targets to attack. And this trend continues in the War Within. There are a few reasons to attack Boomies. For one, they take a lot of damage, and outside of Barkskin and Renewal, they don't really have great survival options. For the most part, Boomies are forced to face tank damage or shift into Bear and see their DPS plummet. Attacking a Boomie can also completely shut down their ability to Cyclone, which aside from being part of their win condition, is also their #1 tool for staying alive. For the second expansion in a row, Boomkins are dying a lot in Arena. Because of this, Boomkin will be going in the good to train category. Last expansion, Feral was also a good target to attack too, and actually had the highest death rate in the game thanks to this little guy here. But now that it's gone, are ferals still a good target? Turns out the answer is yes. While feral has a slightly better defensive kit, it still takes an absurd amount of consistent damage. Most feral druids will be playing Wild Stalker, which even has less bulk than its druid of the claw counterpart. Survival Instincts is the main cooldown worth paying attention to, since with the new Oak Skin talent, it provides 60% damage reduction. That's an easy swap if I've ever seen one. And just like Boomy, Cyclone is still a threat, even if it no longer funnels them damage. So as a spec that takes high damage and is important to shut down, Feral Druid will also be going into the good to train category. Moving on, Evokers can be deceptively tanky, so let's find out why. At the start of Dragonflight, Devastation Evoker was actually on the squishier side, but things have changed. Thanks to the new Slipstream hero talent, Devastation Evokers can have some pretty ridiculous mobility, being able to reset both hover charges after using Deep Breath. If you're a low mobility melee, sticking to an Evoker might be a huge problem. Their same hero spec gives them 10% additional damage reduction on Obsidian scales, which by the way, they have 2 charges of, allowing them to not only be tankier but also more aggressive at the same time. Finally, training a Devastation Evoker doesn't really do too much to shut their momentum down, since they have so many spell schools to work with. Unironically, the best way to deal with Evokers is to treat them like a melee, using roots to keep them pinned down and out of your range. Augmentation Evokers are also quite tanky too, with their hovers also granting 20% damage reduction, which they can also reset using Time Spiral and Time Skip, which also CDRs all defensives. So the same mobility traps for Devastation also apply to Aug. If all this wasn't enough, Augmentation even has a cheat death mechanic. Sort of annoying, but it's not that bad to deal with. Anyway, Evokers can be quite tanky, and if you can't 100-0 them in a stun, then there's still a high chance they will easily slip away, putting them in neutral for now. Next up, we have our 3 Hunter specs, which have all gotten some pretty big defensive buffs in the War Within. Their shield wall, which is called Survival of the Fittest, now has an additional charge thanks to the new padded armor passive, which means hunters are now running around with a higher defensive budget. Mark's Hunters even take this a step further by having the Smokescreen passive as a part of their Dark Ranger hero spec, causing their self-heal and wall to proc each other at a slightly reduced effect. It's a buy one get one free deal for their defensive kit. If you play a spec with high burst, you'll need to make sure hunters are stunned, since Feign Death also provides a massive 90% damage reduction for a few seconds. Good luck landing a kill through that. So if you're wondering why hunters suddenly feel more tanky, now you know. With that said, Marks can still be a really good target in melee heavy lobbies. Even though you can't interrupt their casts, sticking to them does mean a higher chance of getting clutch disarms off when needed. BM Hunters are a bit less punished when attacked. Training them doesn't really do much to stop their damage, as they can do their entire rotation while moving. The same is true for Survival. Attacking them doesn't really stop much damage at all. You could argue that pressuring Hunters makes it harder for them to land traps, but sometimes CC isn't even needed to win in Solo Shuffle anyway. So as one of the hardest classes to actually shut down and with more tankiness than ever before, all 3 Hunter specs will be going in the neutral tier. Mage is a bit tricky to rank in Solo Shuffle, and we need to treat all 3 specs differently. Right away, we're going to put Fire in the good to train category, but we're going to hold off on the other 2 specs for now. Over the years, Fire has lost a lot of its tankiness. The spec that was once hailed as the god of Shadowlands has been reduced to a mid-tier or even low-tier joke in Solo Shuffle. And a big reason for this is the removal of Flame Cannon, a PvP talent that added extra range and, more importantly, bonus stamina, which help offset the HP loss from running Glass Cannon, a hard-locked PvP talent that makes the spec actually deal damage. The joke is that Fire Mages aren't really Glass Cannons, but instead just Glass Noodles. Overall, the spec feels extremely frail in the current meta, especially against the legion of Hunters that have flooded the bracket. Frost and Arcane, on the other hand, deserve a lot more respect and can be very difficult to kill for some lobbies. While every mage spec is jam-packed with mobility, Frost has the added benefit of having tons of snares and even RNG roots, which can make it difficult for anyone, not just melee, to stay connected. Your best bet to actually take a Frost mage down is to either lock them on Frost on low HP, or sneak in a kill while Hypothermia is active, denying them from using their second ice block. While Arcane can feel quite slippery, the ability to cast while moving and even channel spells out of LOS makes it a bit difficult to truly pin down, and you should avoid committing to an Arcane mage unless you absolutely need to shut down their damage. We will warn you that training a mage without a Marks Hunter on your team can be quite difficult, especially as a melee. So since Frost and Arcane can be very difficult to actually keep in one place, they will be going in the skill check tier. Windwalker Monk is deceptively tanky, but enough to skill check? Let's find out. By now you should know about Touch of Karma and Diffuse Magic, which are two relatively strong 90-second defensives that give monks some reliable options in both the early and late game. But what many players possibly ignore is the Dance of the Wind passive, which gives them a baseline 10% dodge chance, stacking even higher with each attack, something which can be really annoying to deal with as a melee. So while they're not parrying your attacks with Fists of Fury, they might literally be dodging some of your melee hits. So as one of the most deceptively tanky melee in the game, monks will be landing on the skill check tier. Up next is Ret Paladin, otherwise known as food for frost mages. On its surface, Ret seems like it would be a difficult target to attack in solo shuffle. Between Shield of Vengeance, Wall, and Bubble, they have a few strong defensive options. Despite this, Paladins make great targets for any caster-heavy lobby who has the right sort of zoning tools to keep them immobile. And even for other melee, the lack of mobility Ret Paladins suffer from means it's really easy to stay connected. They're basically damage sponges. So as one of the most reliable targets to attack in solo shuffle, Ret will be going on the good to train tier. Shadow Priest is another spec that is deceptively tanky, but still a great target to attack. Once again, on paper, it might seem like Shadow is quite difficult to actually kill, especially as Arcane, who has a slightly better dispersion. Between this, Desperate Prayer, Fade, and Void Shift, there is a lot of defensive standing in your way. But remember, what we also care about is how important a spec is to actually shut down. And the vast majority of Shadow Priest damage comes from casted or channeled spells, which is why we've called Shadow a victim spec in the past. While their damage can be super high, it's very easy to shut down, and you definitely need to stop them from snowballing momentum. So as one of the most threatening casters in the game, Shadow will be going into the good to train category. Moving on, Rogue is the only class in this list who will have one spec in each tier. The squishiest spec out of the three is Assassination. The one thing that will make every Rogue spec a bit challenging to kill is the fact that they all have double Vanish. But with the removal of Shadow Dance for Assassination, this spec will need to use Vanish aggressively in order to spread those big Garrets, leaving Cloak of Shadows and Evasion as the only major cooldowns standing in your way. On top of this, training an Assassination Rogue can limit their ability to deal damage, since the spec is so maintenance heavy. If you can disrupt their tempo, they will be less of a threat. As a result, we're actually going to place Assassination Rogue in the good to train tier. Sub Rogue, on the other hand, is arguably the tankiest spec in the entire game when played well. This is because Sub Rogues not only have 2 charges of Vanish, but even have a shorter Vanish cooldown. And if this wasn't enough, Vanish will even CDR their other defensives, making it much more difficult to get value out of your own offensive cooldowns. Ironically, the best spec at killing a sub-rogue is another sub-rogue, and we think they deserve going in the skill check tier. That leaves Outlaw as our last rogue spec, and they're going to fall somewhere in the middle. While Outlaw continues to have some cooldown reduction on evasion, the spec is definitely less tanky than in the past. Outlaw also needs considerably more uptime compared to Sub, which leaves it a bit more exposed at all times. So for the moment, we think this spec falls somewhere in the neutral tier. Next up is Shaman. Maybe you've heard to train the blue, but does that still hold up for Shamans in 2024? Kinda. Let's dive in. In the past, LE Shamans were a pretty reliable target since they had limited defensive options, especially while stunned. But these days, Shamans are a bit tankier, having more defensive options, including the newly added Stone Bulwark Totem. While they might be easy to attack as a melee, trying to take down an LE Shaman as a caster can be a big mistake, since they're able to stack up 30% magic damage reduction if they manage to wind shear your casts back to back. And above all, training an LE Shaman doesn't really stop their damage by much, especially since most of their pressure comes from instant cast microbursts every 30 seconds. Training the blue doesn't totally apply to LE Shamans these days, so they're going to go in the neutral tier. Enhance has all the same defensive tech as LE, but with 2 key weaknesses. For one, it's a melee spec, obviously, which means being more exposed to damage at all times, especially considering it has some of the worst mobility in the game. On top of this, Enhance definitely relies on its self-healing in order to stay alive, which obviously means in deeper dampening, it becomes a very desirable target. So with a few key weaknesses, Enhancement Shaman will be going into the good to train tier. That brings us to our 3 Warlock specs, who conveniently will all share the same tier. At the start of this video, we mentioned that Affliction has the highest death rate in solo shuffle, but Destro isn't too far behind. Warlocks are some of the least mobile casters in the game, and if you are a melee, then simply being patient with your gap closers should be enough to stay on target. The only real downside of training a Destro lock is that you really don't shut their damage down by much, assuming they are playing the Hellcaller hero spec. This turns their Immolate into an instant cast ability called Wither, leaving Fear and Chaos Bolt as the two main spells to shut down. Demo, on the other hand, requires a significant amount of casting and really needs to ramp its pets up first in order to do any meaningful pressure with Tyrant. While they might get more value out of Soul Link compared to the other two specs, Demo is one of the best targets for any melee heavy lobby since it's so easy to shut down. So with the highest death rates across the board, all three Warlock specs will be going into the good to train tier. Finally, we have our two Warrior specs, who've both turned out to be very good targets. Between the two specs, Arms is arguably tankier, due in part to ignore pain, but this is precisely why Arms can be a good target, since by training it, you will inevitably force them to dump Rage on non-damage globals, and even force them into defensive stance, nerfing their damage. That leaves both Die by the Sword and Rallying Cry as their true defensive options, which aren't too strong compared to other defensive cooldowns. The only tricky part about killing a Fury Warrior is that their main defensive cooldown is actually usable while stunned, but unlike Arms, Fury is more reliant on self-healing in order to stay alive. Both specs can suffer the Death Knight problem, being significantly weaker in dampening, where healing spells are dramatically nerfed. They also suffer the Ret Paladin problem too, being a very convenient target to hit all game, especially in a caster-heavy lobby, since they're almost always exposed to damage. So while it might seem like a hot take, we're going to put both Arms and Fury in the good to train tier. That brings us to our complete targeting tier list for every DPS spec, and with 12 specs being good to train, you should have no problems picking the right target in solo shuffle. Of course, you might be wondering what to do when there's a melee and ranged on the enemy team, and both are the same priority. In the majority of cases, you're safe attacking their ranged, assuming you can shut down their damage, unless your comp is better suited for bullying the melee, which can be the case in triple caster lobbies. And as a general rule, that will always be true. Larger maps are less friendly to melee, and training some casters on maps like Tolvaron can be bait, with potential kiting tools like Gateway or Alter Time getting more value on big open maps. But wait, what about healers? Well, for that, we have to adopt a completely different set of criteria. That's because training a healer from start to finish can be risky. It means leaving both DPS free all game, which can quickly snowball into a loss. So instead, we're going to have two categories just for healers. One for specs that are good to swap to, and another for specs that you probably shouldn't train. First up, let's quickly take a look at the healers that are good to swap to and explain why. First up is Resto Druid, and if you aren't caught up to speed by now, swapping is the key for scoring wins against this spec. Resto Druids need to invest multiple globals ramping up and maintaining their hots, which can simply be countered by hitting whoever has the least healing over time effects, which in some cases is the Druid themselves. Now, this doesn't mean overextending across the map just to hit them for no reason, but instead recognizing when they are pushing in, possibly for a Cyclone, and then immediately punishing them for leaving the pillar. You might not score a kill, but you will force them to swap all of their hots, which in turn gives you the right moment to swap back to the squishiest DPS in order to keep up momentum. If Tranquility and Barkskin are on cooldown, you can potentially kill the Druid outright, so stay on the lookout for hots and monitor their CDs. Preservation is a good swap target too, despite the fact that they can be really annoying to actually kill, but this isn't really the goal when attacking them. Instead, the reason you should pressure Preservation from time to time is because of their mastery, which increases their healing on any target who is lower HP than the Evoker. And with Evokers running around with 40% mastery, it means you can actually cut their healing if you can keep their HP slightly lower than the DPS. Of course, killing an Evoker outright can be a bit tricky, especially with Nullifying Shroud, Emerald Communion, and their 2 charges of Wall. But again, this isn't necessarily the goal. If they're exposed and in the open, you can passively nerf their healing just by keeping them a bit low on HP. Holy Paladin is our next healer that is good to swap to if you can pay attention to a few mechanics. Light of the Martyr causes Holy Paladins to literally put a healing absorption shield on themselves in exchange for some bigger holy shocks. It's the deal with the devil if there ever was one in WoW. Anyway, despite the fact that Holy Paladin defenses were recently buffed, it's still going to be a good healer to pressure, especially when they're out in the open. And with the pre-stacked Necrotic Shield or a Blessing of Sacrifice screaming at you to make a swap. Pallies still need to do quite a bit of casting, and locking them on their Holy School will prevent them from using any of their major defensives, including Bubble. The final healer that is good to swap to is Mistweaver Monk. Now, just like Resto Druids, monks need to do a fair amount of ramping in order for their healing to actually pump. What this means is that anything that can put them off tempo can allow your team to snowball pressure. And outside of port, monks don't really have the best tools to keep themselves alive, since both Life Cocoon and Restoral are also needed to keep their teammates alive too. So not only can you interrupt their ramp, but you can also force some suboptimal cooldown trades by just pressuring them in the open. That brings us to the healers you should avoid training. We're going to lump both priest specs into this category due to one key passive. Focused Will, which is basically a flat 30% damage reduction that can be maintained permanently when hit by melee attacks. Between Fade, Desperate Prayer, and the fact that Oracle Priests simply heal themselves for 30% more, it's kinda tough to train them from start to finish or even pressure them with a swap. If you really want to pressure a priest, you're going to need some sort of silence effects to deny all of their defensives, or need to catch them immediately after using life swap, otherwise they're going to be pretty tanky. Finally, we have Resto Shamans, and if we had made this list 10 years ago, they might have been a really good target to train. But these days, Resto Shamans can sometimes be difficult or outright impossible to train, since the overwhelming majority of their healing is instant cast, and just like Oracle Priests, Shamans will actually heal themselves for more, while also having an auto-proc heal when they fall low on HP. Overall, training the blue doesn't really work in 2024. So with that, we have our targeting guidelines for healers in Solo Shuffle. And we want to remind you that healers are rarely ever the best initial target. More often than not, they're only good to swap to when overextended. And with our premium add-on profiles, swapping to the right target has never been easier. Download our full pack today by visiting the links below. Website members will also get access to all of the exciting new content we've been uploading. We created the world's best damage and healer courses because we made them with the world's best players. That promises you can get ahead and stay ahead with gladiator level game knowledge and a highly optimized UI. As always, we continue to offer a rank up guarantee. If you don't gain at least 400 rating while using skill capped, you don't pay. So visit the exclusive discount links below to get started today with brand new guides and the best PvP UI. For now, we want to thank you all for watching. See you soon.